He bought groceries for a struggling family, then learned who they really were. It was the kind of moment that should have felt ordinary, but something about it made Mark's stomach twist. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe if you love meaningful stories, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I really enjoy seeing where these stories travel. Mark had been in the grocery store for less than 10 minutes, just grabbing milk, eggs, and a loaf of bread. He was already thinking about the rest of his Saturday. But then, in the checkout line ahead of him, he noticed a woman with two small children. The little girl, maybe 6 or 7, was holding a box of cereal to her chest, as if it were treasure. The boy, younger, leaned against the cart, his eyes half closed from what looked like a long day. The woman's cart wasn't full, just the basics: a gallon of milk, a bag of rice, a package of chicken, some canned vegetables. But her hands trembled slightly as she reached into her purse. Mark's eyes drifted to the total on the register. It wasn't much, but it was clearly more than she could cover. "I'm sorry," she murmured to the cashier. "Can you take off the cereal and the apples?" The cashier gave a polite nod and started scanning items in reverse. The little girl's smile faded instantly. "But Mom," she began softly, glancing between her mother and the cereal box. "Not today, honey," the woman said, her voice calm but tight, as if she were holding something back. Mark felt that twist in his stomach again. He had seen this kind of moment before, once when he was a boy, and his own mother had quietly removed groceries from the belt because she couldn't cover the cost. It had been humiliating then. He knew it would be humiliating now. He didn't think long. "Hey," he said, stepping forward. "Just leave those on. I'll cover it." The woman looked startled. "Oh, no, that's okay. I can manage." "It's fine," Mark said firmly, but with a small smile. "Really, let's just get you and the kids home with everything you picked out." The cashier glanced between them, then looked at the woman. "Is that okay?" The woman hesitated for another moment, her lips pressing together, before finally giving a small nod. "Thank you," she said quietly, her eyes fixed on the counter as the cashier finished scanning. The boy perked up a little, reaching for the apples as if claiming them before they could vanish again. The little girl clutched the cereal box tighter, watching Mark with cautious curiosity. When the transaction was done, the woman gathered her bags quickly. She didn't meet Mark's eyes, only gave another faint "thank you" before ushering her children toward the exit. Mark watched them go, feeling the faint awkwardness that always comes with helping a stranger. He didn't know her name, and he didn't expect to see her again. But as he carried his own small bag to the door, he caught one last glimpse of them through the glass. Walking into the gray drizzle outside, the little girl skipping once, the cereal still in her arms. It wasn't a big thing, he told himself, just groceries. But something in her face, something in the way she'd kept her head down, stayed with him as he drove home. And he had no idea that this small, impulsive decision would lead him into a story he would never forget. Mark didn't expect to think about that family again, but the scene kept replaying in his head. He saw the mother's hands trembling as she searched her purse, the way she had tried to hide her disappointment from her kids, and how quickly she had left once the transaction was done. It wasn't guilt he felt. He hadn't done anything wrong. It was more like an unsettled curiosity. He couldn't quite shake the feeling that there was something behind that moment, something he hadn't seen. 2 days later, he found himself back at the same grocery store. He told himself it was because he'd forgotten a few things, but deep down, he wondered if he might see them again. He didn't. The store was quiet, just the usual hum of the coolers and the steady beep of the registers. On his way out, a light rain was falling. He slid into his car, but before starting the engine, he noticed movement across the parking lot. A woman was standing near an older sedan, loading grocery bags into the trunk. Two kids sat inside, faces pressed to the foggy glass. At first, Mark didn't think much of it, until he recognized the little girl's bright pink jacket. It was them. The woman was focused on arranging the bags so they wouldn't tip over. A man in a baseball cap handed her another bag, then waved before getting into a different car and driving off. She lifted the trunk lid a little higher, giving Mark a clearer view of her face. It was definitely her. For a moment he debated whether to say anything. She hadn't seemed eager to talk in the store. Maybe she'd prefer to forget the whole thing. But before he could make up his mind, she turned and spotted him. Her eyes widened briefly, and then her mouth curved into a hesitant smile. "You're the man from the store," she said as he walked over. "Yeah," Mark replied. "I didn't expect to run into you again." She gave a small laugh. "Me neither. I'm Elena, by the way." "Mark," he said, holding out a hand. She shook it lightly, her grip warm despite the drizzle. "I didn't really get to thank you properly," Elena continued. "The other day, I was so flustered, I just wanted to get out of there before I started crying in front of the kids." "You don't have to thank me," Mark said. "It was no big deal." She shook her head. "It was a big deal to me." She hesitated, glancing toward the car where her children were watching curiously. "It's been a rough few weeks." Mark nodded, not wanting to pry, but Elena seemed to wrestle with something before continuing. "I'm not usually in that position," she said, "but my husband's away, and money's been tighter than I expected." "Is he traveling for work?" Mark asked. "Sort of," she replied. Her voice softened. "He's deployed. Military." Mark felt something click in his mind. His own father had been deployed when Mark was a kid, and his family had lived through those stretches of waiting for paychecks, stretching every dollar. "That can't be easy," he said quietly. "It's not," Elena admitted. "The pay's fine once it comes, but there have been delays in the benefits. I'm just trying to keep things going until it's sorted out." She gave a small shrug, like she was trying not to make it sound like a complaint. "The other day, I was deciding between buying groceries and paying the electricity bill. You made that choice for me." Mark didn't know what to say at first. He could see the effort she was making to keep her tone light, but there was real strain in her eyes. "I'm glad I could help," he said finally. Elena smiled again, more genuinely this time. "Well, you did. And my kids haven't stopped talking about the cereal." They stood there for another minute, the rain pattering softly on the pavement. Finally, Elena closed the trunk and said, "I should get them home. But thank you, Mark. Really." As she drove away, Mark watched the little girl wave from the back seat. He raised his hand in return, feeling that same twist in his chest. Only now, it wasn't just curiosity. It was the beginning of something he didn't yet understand. Mark thought about Elena and her kids for the rest of that day. It wasn't just that she'd thanked him again. It was the way her voice had shifted when she mentioned her husband being deployed. That detail lingered in his mind like a thread he couldn't stop pulling. The next Saturday, he was out running errands on the other side of town when he spotted a small farmer's market set up in the lot behind a church. He decided to stop, mostly to pick up fresh bread. He was halfway to the stalls when he saw a familiar figure near a table stacked with vegetables. It was Elena. She had the boy with her, perched in the child seat of a small folding cart. The little girl was a few steps away, studying a basket of peaches. Elena looked more relaxed than the last 2 times he'd seen her. She was chatting with the vendor, smiling in a way that felt unhurried. Mark debated for half a second, then walked over. "We have to stop meeting like this," he said with a grin. Elena turned, startled, then laughed. "Mark, you shop everywhere, don't you?" "I try to keep my options open," he replied. "How are you guys doing?" "Better this week," she said. "I got a small payment through from the benefits office, enough to cover bills for now, and a friend drove us here so the kids could pick something fresh." She reached into her cart and held up a bag of apples. "We're even splurging on these." The boy in the cart grinned at Mark, holding up a half-eaten cracker. Mark nodded. "Glad to hear things are looking up." Elena hesitated for a moment, then tilted her head. "You know, you remind me of someone my husband served with, always going out of his way to help people, even if it was just something small. It's not something you see all the time." "I grew up in a family that got a lot of help when we needed it," Mark said. "Guess it sticks with you." Her eyes softened. "I think that's the only reason I didn't completely lose it at the store that day. It felt like someone was looking out for us." The little girl wandered back with 2 peaches in her hands. "Mom, can we get these?" she asked. Elena glanced at the price tag and nodded. "Sure, but one's for your brother." The girl looked up at Mark. "Are you coming to our house?" she asked without hesitation. Elena's face went pink. "Sophie," Mark chuckled. "I don't think I've been invited yet." The girl's expression was matter-of-fact. "You should. We have Legos." Mark smiled at her, then looked at Elena. "I wouldn't want to intrude." Elena shook her head, still blushing slightly. "It's fine. She gets comfortable with people quickly." They finished at the market together, and Mark offered to help carry the bags to her friend's car. As they walked, Elena told him a little more about her husband, how he'd been gone for almost 6 months, how letters and occasional video calls kept the kids connected, and how she tried to keep their days busy so they wouldn't miss him too much. By the time they reached the car, Mark felt like he'd learned more in 10 minutes than he had in their previous 2 encounters combined. There was a strength to her, but also a vulnerability she tried to mask with small jokes and deflections. As he helped load the last bag, Elena gave him a quick, almost shy smile. "You know, if you're ever bored, you really can stop by. The kids would love it, and it'd be nice to have another adult to talk to." Mark returned the smile. "Maybe I will." She climbed into the passenger seat, waving as they drove off. Mark stood there for a moment, holding the image of her smile in his mind. He realized this was no longer just a passing encounter. It was becoming something that would matter to him in ways he didn't yet realize. Mark didn't wait long to take Elena up on her invitation. The following Thursday evening, he found himself parked outside the small brick apartment building where he had seen her that first rainy day. He sat in the car for a moment, debating whether it would feel awkward just showing up. But she had told him to come by, and the truth was, he wanted to see how they were doing. When he knocked, it was the little girl, Sophie, who answered. "It's you," she said, grinning. Mark smiled. "It's me. Is your mom home?" "She's in the kitchen," Sophie said, already turning to shout over her shoulder. "Mom! Mark's here!" Elena appeared a moment later, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Hey, I wasn't sure you'd actually stop by." "I figured I'd take you up on it," Mark said. "Did I catch you at a bad time?" "No, not at all," she said. "We're just making spaghetti. Come in." Mark stepped inside. The apartment was small but tidy. A few toys were scattered on the living room rug, and a stack of coloring books sat on the coffee table. The boy, Liam, was sitting cross-legged on the floor, building something out of Legos. "Hi, Liam," Mark said. The boy glanced up and gave a shy wave before returning to his blocks. In the kitchen, Elena stirred a pot of sauce. "I didn't expect company, so I don't have anything fancy to offer," she said. "Spaghetti sounds perfect," Mark replied. She smiled faintly. "You might regret saying that after you try it." Sophie tugged at Mark's sleeve. "Do you want to help me set the table?" "Sure," he said. She handed him forks and napkins, pointing to where each went. As they worked, Sophie said in a conspiratorial whisper, "Mom's a really good cook. She just says that so people won't expect too much." Elena overheard and laughed. "Thanks, Soph. Way to keep my secret." Once the food was ready, they sat down together. Conversation was easy at first. Mark asked the kids about school, and they took turns telling him about their favorite subjects. Liam's was math. Sophie's was art. Midway through the meal, Elena set her fork down. "I wanted to tell you something," she said, looking at Mark. "When I told you my husband was deployed, I didn't explain much. I didn't think it mattered, but maybe it does." Mark nodded. "I'm listening." She took a breath. "He's a medic. His unit was sent overseas 6 months ago. It's dangerous where they are. And sometimes, if I don't hear from him for a while, I start imagining the worst." Her voice softened on the last words. Mark kept his eyes on hers. "That must be hard." "It is," she said. "And I've been trying to keep things normal for the kids. But the grocery store that day, it was like everything hit at once. I thought I had it handled, and then I didn't. And then you were just there." Mark thought about the way she had kept her head down at the register. "I'm glad I was," he said. She gave a small smile. "Me too." For a few minutes, they ate in silence, the kids chatting between themselves. Mark could feel the weight behind what she'd said, but he also sensed that she wasn't looking for pity, just understanding. When dinner was over, Sophie insisted on showing Mark her room, which was covered in drawings taped to the walls. Liam proudly displayed his Lego creations. Mark stayed a little longer, laughing with them, before finally standing to leave. At the door, Elena said quietly, "You're welcome here any time. I mean that." "I appreciate it," Mark replied, "and I'll take you up on it." As he stepped out into the cool night air, he realized he no longer thought of Elena and her kids as strangers. Something had shifted. He just didn't know yet where it would lead. Mark didn't visit again for a week, but Elena's words at the door, "You're welcome here any time," kept replaying in his mind. It wasn't just the invitation itself. It was the way she'd said it, with a tone that told him she meant it. So on Saturday morning, after picking up a few things at the store, he decided to drop by. When Elena opened the door, she looked surprised, but pleased. "Mark, I was just about to make coffee. Come in." "Perfect timing," he said, holding up a bag. "Brought some muffins to go with it." Liam's voice came from the living room. "Is that Mark?" "Yes," Elena called back. "Come say hi." The boy appeared in the doorway, rubbing his eyes. "Hi." "Hey, buddy," Mark said. "Still waking up?" Liam nodded, then shuffled back toward the couch where Sophie was already sitting cross-legged, watching cartoons. Mark followed Elena into the kitchen. She poured coffee into 2 mugs and gestured for him to sit at the small table. "How's your week been?" she asked. "Busy, but good," Mark replied. "What about you?" Elena blew on her coffee before answering. "Up and down. I finally got through to the benefits office. They promised the rest of the payment would come next month, so that's a relief. But..." She hesitated. "But?" Mark prompted. She sighed. "The car's been acting up. My neighbor's been kind enough to give us rides when we need them, but I hate relying on other people for everything." Mark tilted his head. "You don't like asking for help, do you?" Elena gave a small smile. "Not unless I have to. I've always been that way." "I get it," Mark said. "My mom was the same after my dad was deployed. She hated feeling like she owed anyone anything." Elena looked at him curiously. Your dad served? Yeah, Mark said. Army. He was gone for almost a year when I was 9. I remember the way my mom tried to keep everything together. There were times when neighbors brought us food or fixed things around the house. I didn't understand then how much that probably meant to her. Elena's expression softened. Then you know what it's like? The waiting, the juggling, the pretending everything's fine for the kids' sake. Mark nodded. Exactly. Sophie wandered into the kitchen, still holding a half-eaten piece of toast. Mom, can Mark help us build a fort later? Elena glanced at Mark. If he's up for it. Mark grinned. I think I can handle that. The rest of the morning passed in a way that felt almost ordinary. After coffee, Mark found himself on the living room floor surrounded by blankets and couch cushions, taking Sophie's very specific fort-building instructions while Liam focused on stacking Lego towers inside the structure. Elena sat nearby, laughing as the kids argued over whether the door should be made from a blanket or the side of the couch. When the fort was finished, Sophie crawled inside and declared it perfect. Liam brought in his Legos. Elena shook her head with a smile. You might regret getting them started, she said. I'll take my chances, Mark replied. By early afternoon, Mark stood to leave. Thanks for letting me crash your morning, he said. Thanks for the muffins, Elena replied. Then her voice lowered slightly. And for not making me feel like a project. Mark frowned gently. I don't think of you that way. I know, she said. That's why I'm saying it. Most people either keep their distance or want to fix everything for me. You just show up. Mark smiled. Sometimes showing up is the most important part. She looked at him for a moment, then nodded. You're probably right. As he stepped out into the sunlight, Mark realized he was starting to feel a sense of responsibility for this little family. He wasn't sure what that meant yet, but he knew he'd be back. Mark came by the following Wednesday evening, but this time he didn't arrive empty-handed. He had a few grocery bags in his arms. Nothing flashy, just basics he'd noticed Elena buying the last time they were together. When she opened the door, her eyes went straight to the bags. Mark, what's all this? Just a few things, he said. I was at the store and figured you could use them. Her brow furrowed. You didn't have to. I know, he interrupted gently. I wanted to. She stepped aside to let him in, still shaking her head. You're making it hard for me to stick to my don't rely on people rule. Mark grinned. Maybe that's the point. Liam ran in from the hallway, his socks sliding on the floor. What's in the bags? Why don't you help me unpack and find out? Mark said. The boys started pulling items from the bags. Milk, eggs, pasta, apples, peanut butter. Sophie appeared a moment later and gasped when she saw a box of the same cereal from that first day in the store. You remembered, she said. Of course, Mark replied. Couldn't forget the cereal. Elena stood by the counter, watching the kids buzz with excitement over groceries. Her voice softened. You know, it's not really about the food. It's about not feeling alone in it. Mark met her eyes. I get that. After the bags were emptied, Elena put a kettle on for tea while the kids went back to playing in the living room. She leaned against the counter. I haven't told many people, but my husband's due home in a few months. I've been trying to make sure everything's in order before then. I don't want him worrying about us when he's already dealing with so much over there. Mark nodded. Makes sense. You want him to walk into a stable situation. Exactly, she said. But it's been harder than I thought. There are nights when I put the kids to bed and just sit here wondering how I'm going to stretch what we have until the next check comes in. Mark didn't say anything right away. He knew that anything he offered could feel like charity, and he didn't want her to feel that way. Finally, he said, "You've done more than most could in your situation, and it's not a weakness to let people help." Elena gave a small, almost tired smile. "I'm starting to believe that, mostly because you keep proving it." They moved to the small table with their mugs of tea. The kids' voices drifted from the other room as they argued about which cartoon to watch. Elena set her mug down and looked at Mark. "Can I tell you something without you thinking I'm being dramatic?" "Go ahead," he said. "That day in the grocery store, I was down to my last $40 until the next payment. I had a list, but as I was shopping, I realized even the basics were going to go over. I stood there in the aisle, staring at that box of cereal Sophie wanted, and thought, maybe next month. It was such a small thing, but telling her not today felt like failing her. And then you stepped in." Mark leaned forward. "I didn't know it was that close for you." "I didn't want you to," she said. "But the truth is, you didn't just buy groceries that day. You reminded me that I'm not invisible." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the kettle cooling on the stove and the faint laugh of one of the kids. Finally, Mark said, "I'm glad I was there, and I'm not going anywhere now." Elena's eyes met his, and there was no hesitation in her voice when she said, "I believe you." Mark couldn't stop thinking about what Elena had told him over tea. It wasn't just the details about her last $40. It was the way she'd said it. Calm, almost matter-of-fact, like she had already accepted that this was just the way life was for now. But underneath, he had heard something else. Weariness. And maybe, for the first time, trust. On Saturday morning, he decided to stop by again. This time, he brought more than groceries. He had a small toolbox in the back of his car. When Elena opened the door, she raised an eyebrow at the sight of him holding a bag in one hand and a drill in the other. "Either you're here to help, or you're staging a very small home invasion," she said with a half-smile. "Help," Mark said, stepping inside. "You mentioned last week your kitchen cabinet door was loose. Thought I'd take a look at it." She blinked. "You remembered that?" "Of course," he said, setting the bag on the counter. "It's not a big job, and I'm good with a drill." Sophie appeared from the hallway. "What's in the bag?" "Snacks," Mark said. "Fort-building fuel." Sophie lit up. "Yes!" and ran to tell her brother. While the kids dug into the snacks, Mark crouched under the sink, tightening hinges and replacing a stripped screw. Elena leaned against the doorway, watching. "You know," she said, "most people would have just nodded politely when I complained about that door and forgotten about it." "I'm not most people," Mark replied without looking up. "I'm starting to realize that," she said quietly. When the cabinet was fixed, Mark wiped his hands and turned to her. "All done. It won't be swinging open on its own anymore." "Thank you," she said. Then, almost as an afterthought, "My husband used to do all that stuff. I didn't realize how much I'd miss it until he wasn't here to take care of it." Mark nodded. "My mom said the same thing when my dad was deployed. I was too young to help much, so neighbors stepped in. One guy fixed our washing machine and wouldn't take a dime. Mom baked him a pie as thanks. She still talks about it." Elena smiled faintly. "Sounds like you had good people around you." "I did," Mark said. "And I think that's why I notice when someone could use a hand now." After lunch, they all sat in the living room. Sophie showed Mark a stack of drawings she'd made for her dad. Liam quietly built a Lego tank, occasionally glancing at Mark as if gauging whether it was okay to join the conversation. "You going to send those drawings to your dad?" Mark asked Sophie. "Yeah," she said. "We send him a box every month. Mom puts in snacks and pictures and stuff we make." "That's a good idea," Mark said. "Bet he loves it." "He does," Elena said softly. He says it makes him feel like he's still part of our days. She paused, then looked directly at Mark. You remind me of him sometimes. Not because you look like him, because of how you are with the kids, how you don't make it feel like pity when you help. Mark felt a tightness in his chest at her words. That's a compliment I'll gladly take. For a moment, there was no sound except the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the scratch of Liam's Lego bricks against the floor. Mark realized this was becoming a pattern, these quiet, ordinary moments that felt anything but ordinary. When he finally stood to leave, Elena walked him to the door. You know, she said, you've probably done more for us in the past few weeks than you realize. Maybe, Mark said, but I'm not done yet. Her smile was small, but certain. I know. As he stepped into the afternoon sunlight, Mark knew he wasn't just helping out a family anymore. He was invested. And he had a feeling the story was only beginning. Mark started stopping by Elena's apartment regularly. At first it was once a week, then twice, and before long the visits became part of the family's rhythm. He never called ahead. He just knocked, and somehow it was always the right time. One Saturday morning, Elena opened the door before he even had a chance to knock. Perfect, she said. You're just in time to carry something heavy. Mark laughed. Good morning to you, too. What am I carrying? She stepped aside so he could see the living room. A second-hand bookshelf leaned against the wall, still half wrapped in packing plastic. My neighbor was getting rid of it, and I thought it'd be great for the kids' books. But it turns out it's heavier than it looks. Mark set down the grocery bag he was carrying and went straight to work. Where do you want it? In the corner by the window, she said. That way they can grab books without climbing all over the couch. While Mark maneuvered the bookshelf into place, Liam and Sophie sat cross-legged on the floor, pulling books from a cardboard box. We're organizing them by category, Sophie announced. What categories? Mark asked. Good books, she said, and really good books. Mark grinned. That's a system I can get behind. When the shelf was finally in place, the kids rushed to fill it. Elena stood with her arms crossed, a faint smile on her lips. It's funny, she said quietly. Things keep breaking or needing to be moved, and you just fix them. It's like you're reading my mind. Or maybe I just listen, Mark said. She glanced at him. Not everyone does. They spent the rest of the morning sorting books, then making grilled cheese sandwiches in the kitchen. Sophie insisted on cutting the bread into triangles, because it tastes better that way. Liam nodded solemnly in agreement. After lunch, Elena pulled a shoebox from the hall closet and set it on the table. We're making our next package for Dad, she explained. You want to help? Absolutely, Mark said, sitting down. The kids began selecting items to include drawings, photos, and a small bag of Elena's homemade cookies. Sophie added a handwritten note. We miss you. Mom says we're being good. Mostly. Elena chuckled as she read over her daughter's shoulder. Mostly, huh? Sophie grinned. I don't want him to think it's boring here. Mark folded the letter and tucked it into the box. He's going to love this. For a while, the four of them sat around the table, talking and laughing. Elena shared small stories about her husband, how he'd once accidentally dyed all his socks pink in the wash, how he made pancakes shaped like dinosaurs for the kids. It was the first time Mark had seen her talk about him without that shadow of worry in her eyes. As the afternoon sun streamed through the window, Mark realized something. This wasn't just about helping anymore. He wasn't filling a gap until her husband came home. He was part of their days now, and the kids had started to treat him like someone who had always been there. When it was time for him to leave, Liam surprised him by handing him a Lego figure. You can keep it, the boy said, so you don't forget us. Mark crouched to meet his eyes. I won't forget you. Not ever. Elena walked him to the door. "You've become a constant for them," she said softly. "I'm glad," Mark replied. "They've become the same for me." She smiled. "Then I guess we're all even." As he stepped outside, Mark realized he didn't want this to end when her husband came home. Whatever this was, it mattered. And it was growing into something he couldn't have planned, but didn't want to lose. It was a warm evening in early summer when Elena called Mark and said, "He's coming home next week." Mark was sitting on his porch when she told him. He could hear the excitement in her voice, and underneath it, something else. Nervousness. "That's great news," Mark said. "How are you feeling about it?" "I'm thrilled," she said quickly. Then, after a pause, "and a little anxious. Things have been our way for a while. The kids have their routines, and you've been part of that. It's going to be an adjustment." Mark understood. "It'll be a good adjustment," he said gently. "You've been holding things together for months. Now you get to share that load again." The day her husband was due to arrive, Mark stopped by in the morning with a bouquet of fresh flowers and a small bag of snacks for the kids to take on the drive to the base. Liam grabbed the snacks right away, but Sophie hugged the flowers like they were for her. "You're coming to dinner after, right?" Elena asked as she stood by the door, keys in hand. "Only if you promise not to overcook the pasta," Mark teased. She laughed. "Deal." That evening, when Mark knocked, the door swung open to a scene that made him pause. The apartment was buzzing with life. Laughter, overlapping voices, the smell of Elena's spaghetti sauce on the stove. Elena's husband stood in the living room, tall and broad-shouldered, still in uniform. The kids clung to him like they might never let go. When he looked up and saw Mark, he stepped forward, extending a hand. "You must be Mark," he said. His handshake was firm. "I've heard a lot about you." "All good things, I hope," Mark replied. The man smiled. "All good things." They sat down for dinner, the table crowded with plates of pasta, garlic bread, and salad. The conversation flowed easily, Elena asking about the trip home, the kids chiming in with stories from the past months, Mark quietly filling in the gaps. Halfway through the meal, Elena's husband leaned back in his chair. "I want to thank you," he said, looking at Mark. "Elena told me what you did at the grocery store that day, and everything since. I don't know how to repay you for taking care of my family when I couldn't be here." "You don't need to repay me," Mark said. "It was never about that." The man nodded slowly. "Still, knowing they had someone looking out for them, it made it easier to do my job over there." After dinner, the kids pulled out the shoebox of letters and drawings they'd sent him while he was away. He laughed at Sophie's mostly good letter and showed Liam how he'd kept one of his Lego creations on a shelf in his quarters. When the dishes were cleared, Elena reappeared with something in her hands, a small framed photo. She handed it to Mark. It was a picture of her husband's unit overseas, all of them smiling in the harsh sunlight, with a handwritten note at the bottom. "Thank you for having our six." Mark turned the frame over in his hands, feeling the weight of it. "This means a lot," he said quietly. "It's the least we could do," her husband said. "You're part of our story now." Later, as Mark stood to leave, Sophie and Liam each hugged him tightly. Elena walked him to the door. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what?" Mark asked. "For being here. For making sure we didn't just get through the last few months, but actually lived them." Mark smiled. "You didn't need me for that. You just needed someone to remind you what you were capable of." She shook her head. "Maybe. But we'll never forget what you did." As Mark stepped out into the warm night, the sound of laughter spilling from the apartment behind him, he realized something. He had walked into that grocery store months ago thinking he was just buying a few extra items for a stranger. He walked away now knowing he had been given something far greater in return, a family's trust, and a friendship that wouldn't end just because her husband was home. And in that moment, he knew this wasn't goodbye. It was just a different kind of beginning. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy meaningful stories like this, we'd love to have you as a subscriber.